I was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the lapel of my tuxedo for the third time when my phone buzzed on the bathroom counter. I didn't check it right away. I was too busy rehearsing how I'd say my vows. Casual, heartfelt, not too overdone. I'd spent 19 months preparing for this day, and I wanted every word to feel just right. I glanced at the screen, expecting a text from my best man or a delivery update on the wedding cake. Instead, it was from Erica, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement that shattered everything. "You're too intense, Liam. I feel like I'm suffocating. I'm calling off the wedding. Please don't try to change my mind." I read it once, then again, then once more, just to be sure I wasn't misreading. But it didn't change. The words stayed the same, even as the ground beneath me began to tilt. 3 days before our wedding. 3 days before I was supposed to stand beneath the oak tree at her father's vineyard and promise forever in front of 200 guests. Gone. Canceled. Deleted from the calendar like a meeting that no longer mattered. The silence in the apartment was deafening. My tux was pressed. The rings were boxed. The itinerary for our 10-day honeymoon in Tuscany was taped to the fridge with a magnet that read LNE Forever. Apparently, forever had an expiration date. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat on the edge of the bathtub and stared at my hands. These were the hands that had built our future, our house fund, our travel plans, our list of baby names scribbled on napkins during lazy Sunday brunches. And now, these same hands couldn't stop shaking. The worst part wasn't the broken engagement. It was that I didn't see it coming. Not like this. Not in a text. Not after everything we had built together. I wanted to call her, demand an explanation, beg for understanding. But what would that prove? That she was right? That I was, in fact, too intense, too desperate, too much? Instead, I stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared at the 2 non-refundable first-class tickets to Florence sitting next to a stack of unopened wedding gifts. $6,000. Gone. Just like her. And then, slowly, something inside me shifted. The pain didn't go away, but it evolved. Hardened. Transformed into something less fragile. Less pathetic. I wasn't going to let this story end here. Not like this. I opened my phone again, not to text Erica, but to call someone I never thought I'd speak to again. The one person she always said I should keep my distance from. The same guy I ghosted a year ago, thinking he was part of the problem. Jonah. And as the phone rang in my ear, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If this was the beginning of my public humiliation, then I was going to make sure it ended as a damn legend. The phone rang twice before Jonah picked up. Liam. His voice was cautious, surprised, like he couldn't decide if he was relieved or preparing for confrontation. "Yeah," I said. "It's me." A pause. Not long enough to be awkward, but just enough to remind me of all the space that had grown between us in the past year. I could almost hear him searching for the right words, the safest ones. But I didn't want safe. "I need to ask you something," I said. And I want the truth. All of it. There was a deep inhale on the other end of the line. "All right. Ask." I walked slowly around the apartment, passing by the half-sealed box of wedding favors and the framed engagement photo Erica and I had taken on a windswept beach in Santa Barbara. We looked like the perfect couple back then, young, ambitious, deeply in sync. What a lie. Was there something going on between you and Erica? I asked flatly. "No," Jonah answered. Not like that." I stopped walking. But she came to me a few months ago. Said she wasn't sure she was ready to settle down, that things were moving too fast. "And you didn't think to tell me?" "I wanted to," he said. "But every time I tried, I remembered the look in your eyes when you talked about her. You were all in, man. And she knew that." I sat down on the arm of the couch, my shoulders tight. "So what did she want from you?" "Reassurance, I think. She wanted someone to validate her doubts. And when I didn't, she stopped texting me. I figured she came clean to you and worked it out." I laughed bitterly. "She didn't. Instead, she told me you were trying to drive a wedge between us. That you were jealous." Jonah didn't respond right away. But when he did, his voice was lower. "That's cold." "Yeah," I whispered. "It is." For a moment, we both sat in the quiet. No accusations. No defenses. Just a shared realization that we had both been manipulated, me by love and Jonah by loyalty. And then, without really knowing why, I said. I've got 2 tickets to Tuscany. Everything's booked. First-class flights. 10 days in a villa with a view of the vineyards. It was supposed to be our honeymoon. Jonah let out a short breath. Damn, man. I'm sorry. I don't want to go to waste. He hesitated. You asking me to go? Yeah, I said. I know it sounds crazy, but I need to get out of here. I need space. And I need someone who remembers who I was before all of this. He was quiet for a long time. You sure? No, I admitted. But I've already lost everything else. Might as well lose the heartbreak in Italy. There was a soft laugh. All right, I'll pack a bag. The next 2 days felt surreal. I spent them canceling vendors, returning gifts, and answering awkward calls from relatives and coworkers who'd heard through the grapevine that the wedding was off. The worst was my grandmother. She had picked out a new dress and was so excited to dance at the reception. When I told her the news, she went quiet, then said softly, "Some people don't know when they've got something good. But you remember, Liam, you're still gold." It hit me harder than I expected. Packing for Tuscany was both painful and liberating. Every shirt I folded, every passport document I printed, every pair of sunglasses I tossed into my duffel bag, it all felt like shedding dead skin. I wasn't the same man who had proposed on that rainy dock 2 years ago. That version of me was gone. Jonah showed up at my place Friday night, wheeling in a single suitcase and carrying a 6-pack of local IPA like we were heading to a college reunion. You ready to leave this behind? He asked. Not really, I replied, but I'm ready to try. He nodded. That's enough. That night we stayed up until 2 a.m., not drinking, not rehashing the past, but just being. No filters, no expectations. Just 2 guys reconnecting after a storm neither of us saw coming. When the Uber pulled up the next morning, I glanced back at the apartment one last time. The framed photo was gone, replaced with an empty hook. The champagne glasses still sat on the kitchen counter, untouched, a quiet reminder of a life that almost was. As we drove to the airport, Jonah turned to me. You think she regrets it? I stared out the window, watching the Seattle skyline disappear behind us. If she doesn't yet, I said, she will. And just like that, I turned the page. Not to escape the story, but to start writing a better one. The sun had just begun to rise over Florence when we stepped out of the airport. The air smelled different, crisper, sweeter, like it had never known the weight of heartbreak. I had expected the trip to feel hollow, like a beautiful backdrop painted over ruins. But as the taxi weaved through golden hills and rows of cypress trees, something strange happened. I began to breathe, really breathe, not the shallow, distracted kind you do when you're going through motions, but the kind that fills your chest and makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. The villa was perched on a quiet slope just outside San Gimignano. Rustic stone walls, terracotta roofs, and endless vines crawling across the horizon. The place looked like it had existed for centuries, waiting patiently for someone like me to arrive and fall apart within its stillness. The concierge gave us a quiet nod when we arrived. She didn't ask where the bride was. Didn't ask why 2 men with eyes too tired for their age were checking into a honeymoon suite. She simply handed over the keys, pointed toward the terrace, and said, "Best sunsets in Tuscany." That first afternoon, Jonah and I sat on the terrace in silence. No small talk, no plans, just 2 old friends drinking wine that was probably more expensive than anything I'd ever bought for myself. Watching the sun melt into the horizon like it had nothing else to do but prove that beauty still existed, even when your life was in ruins. "This is insane," Jonah finally muttered, swirling the wine in his glass. "Yep. I mean, not just the view. All of it. You, me, here, on what was supposed to be your honeymoon." I didn't answer right away. I was still staring at the faraway hills, trying to remember what it felt like to expect something good and not fear the disappointment that usually followed. "You think we're allowed to enjoy this?" I asked. Jonah looked at me like I just asked whether we were allowed to breathe. "Liam," he said, "you were left 3 days before your wedding by someone who didn't have the courage to do it face to face. I think the universe owes you at least one perfect sunset." That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because of pain, but because for the first time in weeks, my mind wasn't spinning in panic. It was quiet, And in that quiet, I could hear things I hadn't in years. The soft wind brushing through vineyard leaves, the slow rhythm of my own breath, the creak of old wood floors under my feet. The next morning, we toured the vineyard with an older man named Matteo, who told stories with his hands as much as his words. He had lived on this land his entire life and spoke about the grapes like they were his children. When he learned I was supposed to be on my honeymoon, he paused only for a second before offering a soft pat on my shoulder and handing me a second glass. To healing, he said simply, the days unfolded slowly, like chapters in a novel I hadn't realized I needed to read. We learned to make pasta from a woman who didn't speak a word of English, but whose hands communicated everything. We biked through medieval towns and stopped at roadside markets, buying fresh bread and laughing over how terrible Jonah's Italian was. Somewhere along the way, the ache in my chest shifted. It didn't vanish, but it dulled, softened, and in its place, something else started to grow, a curiosity, a hunger, not for answers, not anymore, but for something real, something that didn't depend on someone else's love to make it valid. On the 5th day, I took a photo. It was just me, standing in front of vineyard at golden hour, holding a glass of wine, half smiling. I uploaded it to Instagram with a caption that read, supposed to be a honeymoon, ended up being something better. Sometimes losing the person you thought you needed is the only way to find the life you deserve. It wasn't meant to go viral, but it did. Within hours, my inbox filled with messages from friends, coworkers, and strangers. People I hadn't heard from in years. People going through breakups, divorces, career meltdowns, or just quiet sadness they never shared out loud. They all said the same thing. Thank you for sharing this. I needed to see that healing was possible. I hadn't realized how many people were silently breaking while still pretending to be okay. And for the first time, I wasn't pretending anymore. It happened on the 7th morning. I was sitting at a small cafe on the edge of town, sipping a cappuccino and sketching notes in my journal, something I hadn't done since college. The cobblestone streets were just beginning to stir. Bakers unloading crates of warm bread, mopeds zipping past with barely a whisper, tourists with wide eyes and guidebooks moving in packs like they were chasing something they couldn't quite name. Jonah had gone off to hike the hills above the villa. I needed space. Not from him, exactly, but from the part of me that still felt like I was living someone else's story. I had just written the words. Maybe losing her wasn't the loss I thought it was when my phone vibrated on the cafe table. I glanced down. Erica, just her name on the screen, was enough to steal the breath from my lungs. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Pretend I was unreachable halfway around the world. But something in me was ready, maybe not to hear her out, but to face whatever was on the other side of that ring. I answered. There was a long pause. Then her voice. Liam? It sounded smaller than I remembered. Tentative. Lacking the confidence that used to coat her words like sugar. I saw the photos, she said quickly. The villa. The sunset. The vineyard. You look happy. I didn't respond. Not yet. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. I didn't think you'd go, she admitted. I don't know. I guess I thought you'd cancel everything. Stay in bed for a week. I finally spoke, my voice flat. You thought wrong. Another pause. Liam, I'm sorry. I know I should have said this in person. What I did, it wasn't fair. I panicked. The wedding felt like a freight train, and I didn't know how to get off without causing a crash. You caused one anyway, I said, eyes fixed on the steaming cup in front of me. You just jumped off and left me on the tracks. I know, she whispered, and I regret it. Regret. That word sat heavy in the air, between the clatter of cups and the laughter of passing tourists. I wasn't perfect, I said. I know I can be intense. I plan too much. I think 10 steps ahead and forget that people aren't puzzles to be solved. No, she said quickly. You were passionate, devoted. I mistook that for pressure. I blink hard. There is something cruel about hearing that now, after everything had already been destroyed. Why are you calling me, Erica? I asked. A beat. Because I miss you, she said. Because I made a mistake and I don't know how to fix it. For a moment, I imagined what it would be like if she had called before all of this. Before the humiliation. Before Tuscany. Before I started putting myself back together. But that version of me, the one who would have jumped at the chance to rewind time, was gone. I'm not coming back, I said softly. She was quiet. I'm not angry anymore, I added. I don't hate you, but I'm not the man you left. That man would have begged, would have flown home and tried to make it work. But now I see that loving someone shouldn't require erasing myself. She choked back something, tears maybe, but I didn't feel the urge to soothe her. That wasn't my job anymore. You really went on the honeymoon? She asked after a pause. Yeah, I said. With Jonah. She exhaled. I always thought you two were too different. We are, I said. That's why it worked. I heard her swallow hard. Well, she said quietly, I hope you find what you're looking for. I smiled, not unkindly. I already did. And with that, I ended the call. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with peace. That night, Jonah and I sat by the fireplace in the villa's common room, sipping wine and watching the logs crackle. The silence between us was companionable, full of understanding that didn't need words. I got a call today, I said after a while. He looked over. Her. I nodded. She regrets it. Says she panicked. Says she misses me. He waited, knowing better than to fill the silence for me. I told her no, I said, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I've finally started liking the man I see in the mirror. Jonah smiled and raised his glass. To that guy. We clinked glasses, and I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth of the wine settle deep in my chest. For the first time in a long time, I felt light. Not because someone loved me, but because I had finally started loving myself. The morning after Erica's call, I woke up before sunrise. The villa was still and silent, blanketed in the soft breath of Tuscany's dawn. I stepped out onto the balcony barefoot, holding a mug of espresso and a notebook I had barely touched since college. The horizon glowed faintly with the promise of light, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to rush anywhere. It struck me how much space I'd reclaimed without even realizing it. Not physical space. The apartment had always been big enough, but emotional space. Mental room. The kind of breathing room that doesn't come from distance, but from finally putting down the weight you've carried too long. For years, I had made myself smaller for love. Less vocal, less assertive, less complicated, but I wasn't less. I was just Liam, flawed, intense, ambitious, and finally beginning to believe that those things weren't curses. They were my fingerprints, the shape of who I really was. I spent that morning walking through the vineyard alone. The dew clung to my shoes, and the birds chirped like they were celebrating something only they understood. I passed workers who waved without asking who I was or why I was there. And I realized, I like being anonymous here. No expectations. No heartbreak narrative to perform. Just a man, in motion, rediscovering his place in the world. When I returned to the villa, Jonah was sitting at the breakfast table with 2 cappuccinos and a map. You feel different, he said without looking up. I am, I said. He finally glanced up and grinned. I was going to ask if you wanted to hit Siena today, maybe rent a Vespa and get lost. But something tells me you've got a different idea. I nodded slowly, sitting across from him. I want to stay. He raised an eyebrow. Stay. Here. In Tuscany. Not forever, but longer than we planned. Maybe another week. Maybe 2. I don't know. Jonah leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable for a moment. And what are you going to do? I paused. Live, right? Think. Be still for once. He gave me a slow nod. That sounds like the most productive thing you've done in years. We spent the rest of the morning making arrangements. Jonah had to return to Seattle. He had responsibilities, meetings, a girlfriend who missed him, but he promised to visit again if I stayed long. I believed him. Whatever had fractured our friendship before had been buried somewhere between bottles of Chianti and late-night talks under the stars. When we said goodbye at the train station, there were no dramatic hugs or emotional farewells. Just a quiet understanding that something important had been restored between us. Something worth protecting. I walked back to the villa that evening alone, and I didn't feel lonely. The days that followed passed like watercolor, soft edges, blurred time. I spent my mornings journaling in a language that felt new and honest. I didn't write about Erica anymore. I wrote about what it felt like to start again, to belong to yourself, to exist without needing to be chosen. The afternoons I filled with wandering, old churches, hidden courtyards, quiet bookstores tucked behind flower stalls. I wasn't a tourist anymore. I was something else, a man in between chapters. One evening, I returned to the same cafe where I'd taken Erica's call. The same waiter recognized me and brought my usual without asking. That small gesture, the familiarity of it, settled something deep in my chest. I pulled out my phone, opened Instagram, and posted a photo of the vineyard at dusk. The caption read, "Sometimes the best thing you can do is stay in the moment that saved you." Minutes later, a comment appeared. From Jonah, "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." On my 10th night alone, I attended a local cooking class just outside the villa. I wasn't there to meet anyone. I just missed the sound of voices, the rhythm of a kitchen filled with activity. The class was small, 8 people, most of them couples. Except one. She stood near the window, stirring something in a copper pot, her hair pulled back in a careless twist, eyes focused like the sauce might reveal the secrets of the universe. We didn't speak much that night, just exchanged glances, nods, half smiles. But I caught her looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. As we left the kitchen, she lingered by the door. "You're not from around here," she said, her accent soft and clear. "American." "Nope," I said. "Seattle." She smiled. "Writer." I paused. "Not yet, but maybe soon." She extended a flower-dusted hand. "I'm Elise." "Liam." We shook hands, and I walked away without asking anything else. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need a story yet, just a new page and the courage to let it turn on its own. I saw her again 2 nights later. Elise, the woman from the cooking class with the quiet focus and the eyes that watched without intruding. I was sitting alone at a hilltop cafe, the kind of place built more for sunsets than tourists. My journal was open beside a half-finished espresso, and I was sketching lines that weren't quite poetry, but weren't exactly prose either. Just fragments of thought, slowly rebuilding my voice. She passed by with a canvas bag of groceries, her hair tied back again, cheeks flushed from the walk uphill. She glanced over, paused, and smiled like we were 2 old neighbors meeting on familiar ground. "You again," she said. I nodded. Guilty. She stepped closer, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You look like you were working on something." "Trying to," I said. "It's been years since I wrote anything just for me. Can I sit?" I motioned to the seat across from mine. She lowered herself carefully, pulled out a bottle of water from her bag, and took a long sip. We sat like that for a while. No rush. No need to fill the silence. It was the kind of silence that made space instead of shrinking it. "I came to Tuscany for the food," she said eventually, "but I stayed for the stillness." I smiled. "I came for a wedding that didn't happen." Her eyes widened just a bit. "Yours was supposed to be." She didn't ask for details, didn't offer sympathy, just sat with the weight of it like it wasn't awkward or sad, just a fact of life, like rainstorms or missed trains. "That explains the journal," she said. "That explains the wine," I replied, raising my glass. She allowed a soft laugh. "I had one of those too. A non-wedding, I mean. Different city, different decade." "What happened?" "He left on the morning of," she said. "Said he felt like a guest at someone else's story." "And you?" "I spent the afternoon in my dress, eating cake with my sister on the kitchen floor." I stared at her, stunned. "That's actually kind of beautiful." She shrugged. "Pain isn't always poetic, but sometimes what we do with it is." That line sat with me. I hadn't cried in days, but hearing it nearly cracked something open. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "You look like someone who's still deciding whether he's broken or just bending." I looked down at my hands. I spent the first few days convincing myself I wasn't the problem, that she panicked, that I gave too much and got nothing in return. And now, I exhaled. Now I think maybe I wasn't the problem, but I was definitely part of the puzzle. I stopped listening. Not to her, but to myself. Elise nodded slowly. "That's the hardest kind of listening." We watched the sun dip behind the hills. The last light of day washed everything in gold. Her hair, the old stone wall behind us, the half-empty wine bottle between us. She reached in her bag and pulled out a small notebook. "Want to trade pages?" I hesitated. "What's the catch?" "No judgment. No edits. Just raw words." I tore out a piece from mine. It was a paragraph I had written the night before. The end didn't destroy me. The pretending did. The trying to make a life fit that was never mine to begin with. I wasn't in love. I was in rehearsal for a life I thought would make sense someday. She read it in silence, then passed me her note. It was just one line. I stopped waiting to be chosen the day I realized I was allowed to choose myself. I let out a quiet breath. That's powerful. She looked at me, not with flirtation, but with recognition. Took me years to believe it. We didn't talk about dating, or futures, or promises. We just existed. Two people who had once been broken by love, now slowly piecing together a version of themselves that didn't need to be explained. That night, I walked back to the villa under a blanket of stars. No music, no messages, no thoughts of Erica. Just me and the echo of Elise's words, still floating in my mind like a gift I hadn't known I needed. I sat on the edge of my bed, turned to a fresh page in my journal, and wrote. The version of me that chased people who couldn't stay is gone. The version of me who stayed behind? He's just getting started. T started with a blank page and a title I almost deleted 3 times. Left at the altar, How I Found My Voice in Tuscany. I didn't know who I was writing it for, not exactly. Maybe for the version of me who sat on the floor, surrounded by unopened wedding gifts, wondering if love was supposed to hurt like that. Or maybe for someone I'd never meet, scrolling late at night, looking for a reason not to feel ashamed of being left. All I knew was this. If I didn't put the words somewhere, they'd keep echoing in my chest until they drowned out everything else. I opened my laptop in the corner of the villa's reading room, where sunlight streamed through ivy-framed windows and the air smelled faintly of old paper and rosemary. It was quiet here, still, like the walls knew how to hold the weight of untold stories. The words came slowly at first, hesitant, like stepping onto ice you're not sure will hold. But once I started writing from honesty instead of defense, everything changed. I wrote about the moment I read Erica's message, about how I stared at our wedding playlist looping in the background like a cruel joke, about the espresso machine that still sat in the kitchen untouched because I didn't know how to make lattes the way she liked them. And then I wrote about the flight, the vineyard, Jonah, the silence that didn't demand performance, the morning walks, the first conversation with Elise, the way it felt to sit across from someone who saw your pain and didn't flinch or fix, just witnessed it. I didn't edit much. I didn't polish it to sound wise or well-adjusted. I just told the truth. And at the end of it, I added a simple line. You're not unlovable just because someone couldn't stay. That night, I posted it on Medium under a pseudonym, LP Rivers. No photos, no links, no backstory, just the writing. I turned off my notifications and went to bed without checking if anyone read it. The next morning, I woke to sunlight and the smell of pastries drifting from the villa's kitchen. I stretched, not with urgency, but with ease. My phone was still on silent when I opened it, expecting maybe a few comments from strangers, or nothing at all. Instead, there were over 10,000 views, hundreds of comments, dozens of messages in my inbox. People from all over the world, Brooklyn, Sydney, Vancouver, Cape Town. Some left by partners who had been ghosted or abandoned days before wedding. Others from people who had done the leaving and regretted it ever since. One woman wrote, I left him because I thought love wasn't supposed to feel ordinary. But now I realize I was just afraid of peace. A man from Oregon said, your words put shape to what I've been trying to understand for 2 years. Thank you for saying what I couldn't. And then, this one from a teacher in Montana. You helped me forgive myself for being heartbroken. Not everyone leaves with a warning. Sometimes they just vanish, but we still get to choose how the story ends. I sat with those words longer than I expected. I hadn't thought my pain would mean anything to anyone but me. I believed for too long that being left made me a failure, that not being chosen meant I wasn't enough. But here was proof, raw, unscripted, honest, that maybe, just maybe, the healing wasn't just mine to keep. Later that afternoon, Elise and I crossed paths again, this time in the Sunday market. She was picking out oranges, inspecting each one with quiet precision, when she noticed me watching. Careful, she said, these stories sneak up on you. I grinned. Too late. We walked the aisles together, chatting about nothing important. The smell of basil, the musicians playing down by the fountain, the local wine we both pretended to understand. And somewhere between the vendor with the handmade journals and the old man selling lavender sachets, I told her. I wrote something, I said. Posted it last night. She raised an eyebrow. The truth. I nodded. And how do you feel now? I paused. Lighter. Like I stopped carrying someone else's silence. She smiled gently, brushing a hair behind her ear. That's the start of real peace, you know, when your story no longer needs to prove anything. I nodded, and in that moment, I realized something simple and profound. I wasn't trying to be brave. I wasn't trying to be impressive or noble. I was just done hiding. That evening, I poured a glass of red wine and sat on the terrace alone. The air was still warm, the sky bleeding into hues of orange and plum. I watched the sun set with my feet propped on the railing and my notebook open in my lap. I didn't write anything that night. I just sat still, letting the world move without me needing to catch up, letting the quiet affirm what I finally understood. Being left behind doesn't mean you're broken. It just means someone wasn't capable of holding the place you built for them. And maybe, just maybe, that place wasn't meant for them after all. The question came quietly, almost like a whisper against the hum of cicadas in the distance. So, when are you heading back? Elise asked it over breakfast on the veranda. Soft-boiled eggs, figs, and toasted bread between us. Her tone was casual, but I could feel the weight behind it. Not pressure, just curiosity. But even that felt like a test I wasn't quite ready to answer. I don't know, I said, stirring honey into my coffee. I haven't booked a return flight yet. She tilted her head slightly, a gentle smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. That's not the same as saying you want to stay. I know, I replied. That's because I'm still figuring out if I've finished what I came here to do. She nodded and didn't press further, which I appreciated more than I could say. That was one of the things I liked most about Elise. She didn't need to fill silences. She gave him room to breathe. Maybe because she understood, like I was beginning to, that answers don't always come fully formed. Sometimes they grow in the quiet between questions. After she left for her volunteer shift at a nearby community garden, I wandered back to the villa, stopping to pick wildflowers on the side of the road like I used to as a kid. I tucked one into the spine of my journal and placed it on my bedside table. That afternoon, I sat down with my laptop and reread the article I had posted the week before. I had meant it as a one-time purge, a way to unburden myself. But now, looking at the comments section still growing day by day, I saw something else entirely. I told her about the email, the position, the salary, the implied prestige, the man I used to be. And, she asked, and I don't know if that man exists anymore. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stopped walking and turned to face me. Let me ask you something, she said. Are you hesitating because you don't want to go back, or because you're afraid of what happens if you don't? That hit harder than I expected. I think. I'm afraid of what people will think if I don't take it, I admitted. Like all of this, staying, writing, slowing down, looks like failure to them. To them, she echoed. I nodded. Do you think it's failure? She asked. No, I said. I think it's the first time I've stopped lying to myself. Elise smiled. Then who cares what it looks like? We sat on the ground, watching the last stretch of sun bleed out across the fields. I used to think healing looked like rebuilding everything exactly as it was before. I said, same career, same city, same man, just patched up. And now I think maybe healing looks like building something completely new. No templates, no expectations, just what feels honest. Later that night, I sat alone on the terrace, rereading David's email one more time. I wrote back a single sentence. Thank you, but I'm not that man anymore. Then I closed the laptop and reached for my journal. I don't need a title to feel valuable. I don't need a job to define my worth. I don't need to go back to prove I'm okay. It was the first time I'd ever walked away from something that powerful without a trace of regret. And it felt like freedom. Not loud, not cinematic, just quiet, full-bodied, and rooted in something deeper than ambition. For the first time, I wasn't chasing something. I was choosing myself. The days that followed my reply to David's email moved slowly, like they were wrapped in soft cotton. I expected regret to creep in. I expected the what-ifs to crawl their way into my bed at night and whisper doubts into my ear. But none came. Instead, I felt steady. Not euphoric. Not triumphant. Just grounded. Like I had finally stopped swimming against a current I didn't realize had been dragging me for years. One morning, while I was sipping my coffee by the open kitchen window, the villa's owner, an elderly woman named Signora Bianchi, shuffled in with her usual basket of lemons and herbs. She barely spoke English, but every morning she'd smile at me and place one lemon by the sink as if it were a gift rather than produce. That morning, she pointed to the stack of handwritten pages on the table and said softly, "Scrittery. Writer." I smiled, unsure if she'd read anything or simply recognized the rhythm of someone who had finally learned how to sit still long enough to listen to their own thoughts. "See," I said. "Maybe." She tapped the table twice, approvingly, and went back to arranging her herbs. I stared at the lemon she'd left me. A simple offering. And I realized, not for the first time, that the universe doesn't always speak in thunderclaps and revelations. Sometimes it speaks in quiet, ordinary gestures that say, "You're on the right path. Keep going." That evening, Elise invited me to visit the small studio she rented above a bakery in town. I had never seen her paintings before. I wasn't sure if she considered herself a real artist or just someone who needed color to breathe. But when she opened the creaky door and I stepped inside, I was stunned into silence. The walls were covered in canvases, some abstract, some soft and fluid, all bursting with feeling. There was one painting in particular that caught me. A window. Simple. Open. Nothing outside, but a deep blue sky with a single brushstroke of gold light. "It's not finished," she said, walking up beside me. "I hope you never finish it," I replied. "It's exactly what it needs to be." She gave me a look, one part curiosity, one part quiet gratitude. Then she walked over to a shelf, pulled down 2 mugs, and poured us each a small cup of grappa. "I wasn't always like this," she said, sitting on the paint-splattered couch near the window. "I used to be someone else entirely." I joined her. "Who were you?" "An advertising executive in Chicago," she said. "I wore heels I hated, answered emails at 2 a.m., and had a smile that never quite reached my eyes." "What happened?" "My fiancé called off our engagement 6 weeks before the wedding," she said without bitterness. "Told me I didn't feel real to him anymore." I exhaled slowly. "That's brutal." She shrugged. "It was the best thing that ever happened to me." She told me how she came to Tuscany on what was supposed to be her recovery trip, how she planned to stay 2 weeks, how every time she tried to leave, something pulled her back. "I realized," she said, "that I didn't miss him. I missed the idea of being chosen, the illusion of certainty." Her voice softened. "But you can't build a real life on illusion. You can only build it on truth." That line stayed with me. You can only build on truth. The next morning, I got up early and went into town. I walked past the bakery, past the bookstore, past the piazza where musicians were setting up, and found a small print shop tucked behind a flower stall. The owner spoke just enough English for me to explain what I needed. By noon, I had 10 printed pages in my hands. 10 essays. 10 chapters of something that had started as pain and evolved into reflection. I didn't call it a book. Not yet. I called it the Stay Behind Journals. Later that afternoon, I met Elise by the vineyard. She had her sketch pad. I had my pages. We sat under the same olive tree we'd found weeks ago, back when everything still felt fragile. I handed her the packet. She didn't read it right away, just held it in her lap like something sacred. "Is this goodbye?" she asked. I shook my head. "This is permission." To do what? To live differently. To share what this place gave me. Whether I stay here or go elsewhere, I don't want to go back to who I was pretending to be. She smiled softly. "You never needed fixing, Liam. You just needed to stop abandoning yourself." That night, I walked back to the villa with one thought in my chest, pulsing like a heartbeat. I may have been left, but I was never lost. The first email came 2 days after I left the stack of printed essays in a small, family-run bookstore off via San Mateo. I hadn't planned to leave them there. I had only wandered in because the sign in the window said Silenzio Prezioso, precious silence. Inside, the air smelled like dust and ink, and there was a single shelf labeled locally created. I asked the old man at the register, in clumsy Italian, if I could place a few essays there, free to take, no strings. He looked over the pages with mild interest, then gave me a small nod. Le parole trovano la loro strada, he said. The words will find their way. I left without expectation. But 2 days later, my inbox pinged. The subject line was simple. Your pages found me. The message was from a woman named Sophia, a schoolteacher from Naples visiting Tuscany for the week. She had picked up my printed essays while her daughter played with sidewalk chalk outside the bookstore. She wrote, I read your words while sitting on a bench with a view of the hills. I cried, not because I'd been left like you, but because I realized I had been leaving parts of myself for years, quietly, politely. Thank you for giving me permission to stay. I read it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and sat in stillness, letting the weight of that sentence settle over me. I had been leaving parts of myself for years. It was the sentence I never knew I was writing toward. That afternoon, I met Elise in the town square. She was sitting at a fountain, her sketch pad closed for once, eyes turned upward toward the old clock tower. She looked like she was measuring time differently, like it no longer pressed on her shoulders. I'm leaving in a week, she said gently as I sat down beside her. I didn't flinch. Where to? Back to the States. Not forever, just a visit. My sister's getting married in Vermont, and I think I owe it to myself to show up as who I am now, not who I used to pretend to be. I nodded slowly. You're not running? No, she said. For once, I'm walking. We sat in silence, watching the pigeons gather and scatter, the clinking of espresso cups in the background, the accordion music floating from the far side of the square. Elise, I said after a while, do you ever wonder if this, what we found here, is something you can take with you? She didn't answer immediately. Then, I think the stillness we've found isn't tied to this place. It's tied to the choice we made to slow down, to listen, to stop running toward approval. I looked at her, really looked. For the first time, I realized we weren't mirrors. We weren't perfect counterparts. We were fellow travelers who had collided at just the right moment. 2 people on parallel journeys, walking side by side for a little while. I think I'm going to publish the essays, I said quietly. Her eyes lit up. Under your real name? I nodded. No more hiding. She reached into her satchel, pulled out something wrapped in brown paper, and handed it to me. I painted something. For you. I opened it slowly. It was the window painting, the one I had admired in her studio. But now there was something new, a figure standing in front of the window, gazing out. No face, no details, just the shape of someone becoming. You finished it, I whispered. She smiled. No, I just made room for you. The next morning, I sent my essays to a small independent publisher based in Oregon. No pitch, no proposal, just a note. These aren't about heartbreak. They're about what comes after. I'm not sure they're even a book, but they're honest. And I think people are starving for that. I didn't check for a reply right away. Instead, I spent the rest of the day walking the hills, watching the leaves turn the faintest shade of orange. Autumn was coming, and I wasn't afraid of it. Elise left the following Tuesday. We didn't say goodbye. We said for now. She boarded the train with her sketchpad tucked under one arm, and her eyes full of the kind of clarity you only get when you stop trying to control everything. I stood on the platform until the train disappeared. And for the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel like I was staying behind. I felt like I was staying whole. That night, I received another email. This one from the publisher. Your voice is clear, and your heart is honest. We'd love to talk about sharing this with more people. Not to sensationalize your pain, but to amplify your peace. I read it once, then again, and instead of feeling nervous or overwhelmed, I simply smiled. The words had found their way, and now so had I. When the plane touched down in Seattle, I wasn't the man who had left. I knew it before the seatbelt light dimmed, before the cabin doors opened, before I stepped back into the soft gray skies of the city that had once defined me. This place used to feel like proof, of achievement, of identity, of motion, but now it just felt like a setting. And I, finally, felt like the author. I didn't return to my old apartment. I had already let the lease go from abroad. Instead, I checked into a quiet Airbnb tucked between 2 leafy neighborhoods, the kind with old wooden floors and mismatched bookshelves someone had clearly built by hand. The host had left me a note, Take your time here. This space was made for breath. That night, I slept with the windows open. No playlist, no podcasts, no distraction, just breath. The publisher moved quickly. Within weeks, the Stay Behind journals was prepped for print. A modest run of a few thousand copies. No fancy marketing, no book tour. Just a quiet release into the world. That was all I wanted. I wasn't interested in bestseller lists. I didn't write to be seen. I wrote to tell the truth. Still, the response surprised me. Emails came in by the dozens, then hundreds. From young men just out of college who'd been ghosted and blamed themselves. From women who had walked away from weddings and were still grieving a future they never truly wanted. From retirees, divorced after decades, rediscovering who they were beneath the decades of compromise. One message read, "Your words didn't save me. They reminded me that I could save myself." That was enough. That line stayed with me. Another came from Jonah, of all people. I bought 3 copies. One for me, one for my sister, and one for the person I was a year ago. I owe you more than I can say. I hadn't heard from him since we said goodbye in Florence. Reading that message, I didn't feel the need to reply right away. Some friendships are like constellations. You don't always see them up close, but you know they're still up there, shining quietly. A month later, I received a letter from Elise. Not an email, a letter, folded neatly inside a pale blue envelope with no return address, postmarked from Vermont. Her handwriting, soft and deliberate, filled a single page. Liam, Vermont was beautiful. My sister glowed. I cried, but not for the reasons I expected. I cried because I saw a version of love that didn't make me feel small. And I realized I want to feel that too. I've started painting again, really painting. Not for galleries, not for commissions. Just to say what I can't always speak aloud. And I've been reading your essays out loud to myself at night. Not because I miss you, though I do, but because they remind me that peace isn't something you wait for. It's something you let in. I'll be in Seattle in December. No expectations. Just coffee, if you're open to it. With care, Elise. I read it twice, then placed it on the windowsill next to a small ceramic vase I'd bought at a street market in San Gimignano. It didn't feel like a beginning or an ending, just an invitation. And those, I'd learned, are best accepted slowly. December came wrapped in rain and pine trees. Seattle was quieter, and winter, like it, too, had learned how to soften. I found a rhythm that wasn't based on deadlines or approval. I wrote, I read, I spoke at small libraries, not auditoriums. Sometimes 3 people showed up, sometimes 30. And every time, I read the same line aloud. Being left isn't the end of your story. Staying, when the world says run, is where it begins. When Elise arrived, we met at a corner cafe in Capitol Hill. It smelled like cardamom and burnt espresso. She wore a wool coat the color of stone and a scarf I recognized from Tuscany. When she saw me, she smiled. Not the kind of smile that begs to be remembered, but the kind that feels like recognition. Like home. You came back, I said. She shook her head gently. I didn't come back. I came forward. We didn't talk about what we were or weren't. We talked about art, about stillness, about the strange and beautiful ache of becoming. And as the rain drizzled softly against the cafe windows, I realized something. This wasn't a story about a man who got left. It was about a man who stopped leaving himself. And somehow, in the middle of letting go, he found not just someone, but something to build with. Not from desperation, but from peace. 1 year later, there's a cabin tucked into the hills above Lake Crescent in Washington. It doesn't show up on maps, not the ones tourists use anyway. The gravel road that leads to it curves through a forest of evergreens and wildflowers that bloom in strange, beautiful defiance of the cold. This is where I live now. Not permanently, just intentionally. The front porch faces west. In the late afternoon, the sun cuts across the water like a promise. Most evenings, I sit there with a mug of tea, a pen, and whatever journal I'm filling at the time. Some pages become essays. Some become letters. Some become nothing but breath translated into ink. I like it that way. Elise comes by every couple of weeks. She started leading small art retreats in the area. Quiet weekends where people gather not to learn how to be better artists, but to remember how to be more honest once. Her work is still raw, still full of color that feels like weather systems. Changing, necessary, never still. We don't live together. We don't need to. We meet where we meet, always by choice. Always without fear of loss. One evening last fall, she stood on the porch beside me, sketchbook in one hand, her eyes watching the fog roll off the lake. I used to think I needed to be found, she said softly. And now? I asked. She looked at me with that steady gaze of hers, the one that doesn't rush, doesn't demand, only sees. Now I know I was never lost. The Stay Behind Journals is now in its fourth printing. I still don't call myself an author. The label feels too polished for what I do. I just write. Sometimes people read it. Sometimes they don't. I don't check the numbers anymore. But the messages still come. A father who read the book after his divorce and now takes his daughter hiking every weekend instead of drowning in shame. A teenager who found the courage to walk away from a toxic relationship before the wedding planning even began. A widow who told me that grief doesn't have to be a grave. It could be a garden. I print some of the letters and pin them to a corkboard in my study. Not as trophies, but as reminders that the truth, spoken gently, can still change the world. Sometimes, I reread the message that started everything. The one Erica sent before the wedding. You're too intense. I feel like I can't breathe. I no longer wince when I read it. Because I know now, I was never too much. I was simply too honest for someone still hiding from their own reflection. And that's not a flaw. That's freedom. If there's one lesson I keep coming back to, it's this. You don't need to be chosen to be worthy. You don't need to be chased to matter. You don't need a perfect ending to begin again. Sometimes the most beautiful lives are born not in the spotlight, but in the quiet places where you finally hear your own voice, clear and unafraid, saying, I'm still here. I stayed. And in staying, I became.